Good morning and welcome to the Bellingham City Council Committee meetings. Today is Monday, December 13th, 2021. This is our final council meeting for the year. So we will begin today with committee meetings and then obviously reconvene this evening with our regular meeting. So starting this morning at 10 a.m., our first committee meeting is Public Works and Natural Resources, which is chaired by Councilmember Lillquist. So I will turn it over to him at this time.
Thank you, Hannah. So we're ending the year with a bang. We have a full schedule both this morning and in the afternoon. I hope we can get through all of our items. We have 4 of them, hour and 15 minutes to do so. The first item is the consideration of donation of real property for city ownership and maintenance of stormwater facilities located thereon. The city, that is the administration at this point, is seeking to assume ownership and maintenance of a stormwater detention pond serving the Glengarry Estate subdivision at the northwest corner of James Street and Telegraph Road. The stormwater tract was never actually transferred from the developer to the homeowners of Glengarry Estates, and as a result, the pond has not been maintained. The developer is now deceased, and Mr. Titterington is the sole beneficiary under the decedent's will. Mr. Titterington has offered a quitclaim his interest in the stormwater parcel to the city at no cost to the city. Per city code, real property donations must be accepted by the city council ordinance. Acceptance of this stormwater facility is consistent with previous actions of the city regarding ownership and operation of stormwater facilities in single-family residential neighborhoods. We've done several of these over the last few years. Sometimes they come with a lot of overdue maintenance and sometimes they don't. So hopefully we'll address that topic. Mr. Johnston, is there more to add at this point?
Excuse me, not very much, but yes, you are correct that sometimes the first year we've got to put a little bit more work to get it back onto full operation, but the future years are generally just routine maintenance. So just par for the course. There is one little twist to this particular donation of the stormwater tract, and that's called out in the whereas provisions of the proposed ordinance. The city does have a project to install a traffic signal at the corner of James and Telegraph. And depending on how the donation, once the donation is accepted by the city council, assuming that it would be, we still need to work through the transfer or the right-of-way portion of this tract with the state agencies responsible for ensuring that we have proper title to right-of-way for that state and federally funded project. So that's just a slight little nuance with this particular one. Our hope is that this dedication of this stormwater tract to the city of Bellingham facilitates that particular right-of-way process with the DOT. However, we might need to take future actions on that related to the stormwater tract as well. So not really relevant to the need for the city to take ownership of this detention pond for stormwater purposes, just to make the council aware for that basis for that whereas clause of slight complication as it comes to the right-of-way acquisition for the James Telegraph project. But our recommendation is to proceed forward with this donation as a stormwater tract to the city of Bellingham.
Thank you. Joining me on the committee today are council members Lisa Anderson and Jean Knudsen. Committee members, Lisa, I see your hand up.
Thank you very much and good morning. I was wondering, Mr. Johnston, it does state that basically the fiscal impact is $3,000 to $4,000 a year for maintenance. I was wondering if an analysis was done, since no maintenance has been done on this facility for quite some time. How much is it going to cost to get it up to standards so that then we could just maintain it? Is it still in relatively good shape, not overgrown? I didn't have a chance to go out and take a look at it.
I'm going to ask Mike Ollinger to help me with this, but we typically, a 10, 15, maybe $20,000 on the upper end to get it back into shape, depending on if there's some substantial structural differences. But in most cases, it's just a matter of making sure we get the vegetation out of the way and clearing the channels to make sure it's up and functioning. It's not a massive undertaking to do, not outside the realm of the normal operations for the stormwater utility.
Mr. Ollinger?
Yes, good morning. Mike Ollinger, Assistant Director of Public Works. This pond, we're estimating it to be about $10,000 for that initial setup. This is in actually not horrible condition, but there is some trees and some debris that needs to be removed from the pond.
In the past, when we accepted a stormwater facility that was truly neglected, I think we sought an initial contribution from the responsible parties. In this case, the homeowners are not the responsible parties, and really it's just the estate of the man who passed away.
Yes, and Matt Stamps can help us walk us through how the title transferred through there a little bit. So Matt, can you?
I guess I'm just wondering if it's reasonable for us to ask for a little financial assistance to assume this obligation.
It's probably not worth the effort to go after that. We would probably spend more to get them to contribute than it would for us to actually just do the work ourselves. So
And
from a
the man
practical
who passed
standpoint,
away, I understand that too. Mr. Stamps, is there more to add?
No, I would just echo that. I don't think it's likely to be fruitful. I don't think there's a legal obligation for one. And then in the past, it's been the ones I've been involved in, which is most of them in the last several years, we've taken them on with no financial contribution. In fact, I can't actually remember a single case with a contribution. I'm sure you're remembering correctly, Michael, but I just that would be unusual for these, and not particularly fruitful here to pursue that. So staff would recommend moving forward without that.
Lisa, is your hand still up, or is that a new? Go ahead, Lisa.
Right. And I do support this, and I'm sure we'll move it forward here in a moment, but just it's in the best interest of the city and the residents that we make sure that it stays well maintained in the future. But kind of wondering this, and also just because some of the older storm facilities put in place by developers were done at a particular standard of the time. And now after some of these great rain events we've had, I'm kind of wondering, did anybody take a look to see how well it fared? Was it done to a standard that at this point is still going to be able to serve that that development out there? Or do we think in the future there might have to be additional upgrades to be able to handle the storm runoff in that area? I'm just thinking long range and newer standards, how that might be looking.
Well, the benefit of having that be dedicated to the city is the city has the ability, if we choose to make some improvements to that particular facility, to do that of our own volition, on our own accord. We would not be able to go back to homeowners and say retroactively, you're now required to bring it up to a newer standard. So it is in our interest to make sure that it's in the city, if we so choose at some point in the future to make a change along those lines. But from what I understand, our stormwater facilities, both the public and private, performed fairly well over the last month or so, a couple of minor exceptions. But if there's a future change that needed for that particular facility, that would be best done as the city's a city project as opposed to a bunch of homeowners.
Thank you. I appreciate that. There's a lot of development happening out towards that area. So I was just wondering if it was up to standards, if it would be able to handle more additional runoff. But if there are no other questions, I would move to approve.
We have a motion before us to approve the accepting the donation of a stormwater facility. Is there any further discussions? Gene, you have anything?
Nope.
If this had gone according to the usual procedures years ago, would the developer have deeded this over to the homeowners association, or would they deed it over to the city back when it was created? Matt?
Yeah, I can take that. Back today, it would have been donated. It would have been deeded to the city under today's practices. But at the time, many years ago, that was not the practice. It should have been dedicated to the homeowners association. But unfortunately, it's not totally unheard of out there for developers to neglect to do that, and it just becomes a defunct, what we would call an orphan property. So much so that the county actually takes it off the tax rolls, so it doesn't accidentally get foreclosed upon for tax purposes. So it just sits in orphan status in perpetuity, essentially. So that's a good one for us to take ownership of here and clean that up. Okay.
I agree with the motion. Luckily, there is very little harm, no foul in this particular case. All those in favor of recommending approval of the accepting donation signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, I'll bring that forward with a positive recommendation tonight. The next item is a post-point sludge pumping system replacement. We'll subtitle this one under the category of irony, because this is a reparative facility we're hoping to replace. The post-point sludge pumping system pumps dewatered solids from the centrifuge hopper to the top of the multi-hearth incinerators. And these incinerators we're going to get rid of and are failing at the city's resource recovery plant, sewer plant. This project will replace the failing sludge pumping system with a new pumping system, startup and training on operation. The city received one bid, which was publicly open on November 9th. Award Construction of Ferndale, Washington was responsible bidder who submitted the lowest responsive bid of $1.8 million, including any applicable Washington state sales tax. I don't see an engineer's estimate in this case. Can you please talk about what we think of the price that came in? Mr. Johnston?
I'll turn that question over to Mr. Olinger, but to address the need to do this, if I might, because you're correct, Mr. Lilliquist, this type of equipment would be no longer needed if we are fully up in operation with the digestion. However, we're several years away from that occurring, and we do not have the luxury of not having this particular pumping system functioning and working. So while it is relatively expensive, the $1.8 million to replace these pumps, it is a necessary expense to keep that system functioning for the time and period it'll take us to build the new system, having it up and operational, and then eventually making that system go away. But that's several years down the road. And so, Mike, can you speak to the cost relative to the single bidder?
So the cost for this project, the engineer's estimate, we did not include an engineer's estimate. This was a normal maintenance project, and we didn't go through that process. But through our discovery, we felt that this project was going to come in at about $1.6 million, and it came in slightly higher than that.
Thank you. Committee members.
I'll move approval.
We have a motion before us to approve the expenditure of $1.8 million to replace a failing pump system at the Post Point. So I'm sorry, when did it stop being the Post Point sewage treatment plant and become the resource recovery plant? I missed that memo.
That's a good point. We changed the sign down there about 6 or 7 years ago. So we're trying to communicate to our staff and to the public that we don't look at the wastewater plant as a waste, right? There are benefits that can come out of that, and it's a resource that we're trying to manage. So we're trying to be strategic in the use of that terminology. And Post Point wastewater treatment plant connotates one perspective or viewpoint, but the resource recovery plant at Post Point is a different perspective. So that's we did there wasn't a formal announcement of that. We just changed the sign and started using different terminology, I think 5 or 6 years ago.
I'd like to move that to a formal long-term debate by the city council, I think. Seriously though, Ms. Anderson, your hand is up. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I did have a question, and obviously there's not a lot of choice for approval of this because we need our recovery plant to be working. But I guess I had a little confusion on, at first I was like, oh, good, all this money, it doesn't just mean for 3 years and it goes away. In the second paragraph, it stated staff has consulted with design engineers and these sludge pumps will be compatible with future plant upgrades. So is it just the current plant and upgrades, or is that, will these be compatible to be utilized in the system regardless of like the next generation that's coming forward? So if you could speak to that, because when you just said, we'll need it for a period of time, it seemed to have a little bit of conflict of information for me.
Yeah, so those pumps will be used in the future solids handling process. We will repurpose those pumps.
Lisa, sorry, you're muted.
Oh, I went to unmute. Thank you, because it's a huge expenditure. I know small in the big comparison, but if it was just for a few years, it's a large expenditure. So I'm happy to hear that it will have second life with the new system when it comes on play. Thank you.
Thank you for following up on that, Ms. Anderson. I'm going to go ahead and call the question. All those in favor of recommending awarding the bid for a pump replacement, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, I'll bring that one forward, a positive recommendation tonight as well. Thank you very much. The next item is a report from the December meeting of the Lake Whatcom Policy Group. which I am part of. The main topic for the policy group discussion this time had to do with updating the models that are used with regard to the total maximum daily load at Lake Whatcom. There are two models. One of those has to do with the loading model, which is how phosphorus and other pollutants get into the lake, and then the lake response model, which has to do with what happens biologically in terms of the lake when those pollutants enter the lake. The original loading model was developed on limited data way back in 2002 to 2003. As part of the TMDL process, we agreed to reassess that model every 10 years. That revision has been going on with an extensive new data set. The new model is called Hydrocomp Forecast and Analysis Model, or HFAM, and it was developed to replace the current model. This model, again, simulates the phosphorus sediment loading that goes into Lake Whatcom. HFAM results will also be used as inputs to a new lake response model, which is called CE Qual W2. I have no idea what that stands for. Apparently not many people do. We forgot what it's called. The next steps include additional calibration of the model against actual data. So basically you run the model and it says what you think will happen in the lake, and then you actually see what does happen in the lake. And so far we've got a very good fit for the most part. So the model is trustworthy looking at actual data, and therefore it's assumed to be trustworthy for future weather events and future activities which have not yet happened. Data collected and analyzed a few years back showed the diversion. Oh, the other issue has to do with the diversion dam from the middle fork of the Nooksack River. The water entering the lake is actually not part of the TMDL process. It's considered part of the background conditions for the lake and something that doesn't need to be addressed. Data collected and analyzed a few years back show that the diversion results in actually less phosphorus into the lake than was originally assumed during the TMDL model development. So the amount of phosphorus coming to the lake from the Nooksack does not need to be addressed, but thankfully it's smaller as a background condition than we thought it was before. That was the primary topic for the Lake Whatcom Policy Group. This is for information only. The next item, and we'll move through these pretty quickly, really appreciate this, is emergency repairs resulting from the November flood. A series of intense and significant rainfall events between November 14th and December 2nd of this year caused widespread flooding in Whatcom County and within city limits. Within the city, numerous roadways, city parks, and trails were flooded, and a single lane bridge crossing Chucknut Creek on the far south side of Bellingham, here where I live, at 19th Street was damaged beyond repair. As a single access point, homes on the far side of the creek were inaccessible. City crews and contractors completed installation of a temporary bridge to provide access. However, a permanent replacement with all appropriate permitting will be needed in accordance with Bellingham Municipal Code 4.80.010. Since the cost for the repair to the bridge and cost to repair for damages to other locations will exceed $40,000, a council resolution declaring an emergency is needed, and the proposed resolution is attached. The costs for emergency repairs is estimated to be in excess of $200,000. I'd also like the staff to address the final permanent replacement costs, which are estimated at least $2.5 million. Mr. Johnson, would you like to begin?
I will. I'll start off, and Mike and Chad Schulhauser can help me walk through some of the more specific details. Pretty big flood events occurred in November, and that particular small creek down there at Chucknut became a very large creek in short order, and took that bridge serving those homes on the far side out. I want to recognize our staff and our partners in the community who helped put a temporary bridge in place in very short order. I think the last week or so ago, we had that bridge up and running, which let the residents get access to their property again, some of whom have some significant limitations on mobility. So we're very pleased to have that temporary structure put into place. However, we will need to replace that or look at all options associated with potential replacement or not replacement as the future comes. The cost to replace that bridge is significant, and the number of homes is very small. So there will need to be a fairly robust conversation about what and how and when we do things. And Mike and Chad, can you talk a little bit about what we did and how we did it and how we replaced that structure and what the pathway forward might be, please?
Sure, I can talk about what we did down there. So we worked with Ram Construction to install a rail car bridge. So that's where we take a portion of a rail car and turn it into a bridge. We replaced the existing abutment that had failed, which caused the the existing structure to fail. We replaced that abutment. We fortified both abutments and placed this new structure, which is now sitting about 2.5 feet higher than what the old structure was sitting. So we should not experience any damage to this temporary structure from debris floating down the creek. As far as moving forward, I'll let Chad speak to the details on that.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, so if we were to move forward, we would need to make it fish passable. So we'd be looking at removal of that temporary bridge, putting in some sort of arch culvert or perhaps a concrete box culvert or a couple of them. The same work we've done on Squalicum Creek and Padden Creek previously. That's where that $2.5 million cost comes from. That's based on an engineer's estimate so that we could turn in some FEMA costs on our PDA on that. We haven't started scoping that yet or any type of preliminary design, but just based on previous designs that we have done on fish passage projects, we're pretty confident in those numbers and the extent of that work that would need to take place down there for that creek.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to that, but the resolution, the packet has to do with emergency repairs at this point. Committee members, Hannah, I'm sorry, Lisa, go ahead.
Thank you. I just kind of want a little clarification. So the emergency declaration is that just to cover the 200,000 spent to get the rail car in and deal with that situation, or does that also cover the $2.5 million going forward to do more of a permanent replacement? That's one question. And the other is, are we going to be eligible to be able to go for additional financing or funds due to the proclamation made by the governor? So I think when it's more of a larger emergency, sometimes you can get additional funds in order to take care of the damage, and just kind of wondering if we're pursuing that specifically, not only for the 200,000 short-term repair, but perhaps a long-term repair.
Shorter answer is yes. So the shorter answer is yes, we have submitted what they refer to as the preliminary damage assessment. That's a document that goes through Whatcom County Department of Emergency Management. That's the first step in recovering funds through the various state and federal agencies for damages incurred during flooding. So we have started that process to recover costs for the project. The resolution the council will be taking covers our costs that we incurred over the last couple of weeks. It does not provide funding for a future replacement. That will need to go through the normal process for budgeting. The replacement of that will not be considered an emergency. However, the recovery of funds to restore may be eligible, for potential contributions from our funding partners at a higher level. But I don't want to underscore the notion that Chad alluded to, which was the fish passage and floodplain requirements and critical areas requirements that will need to be addressed with a permanent structure. The temporary structure that we've installed, while it will be very robust and should be durable for a period of time, it does not, in our early assessment, cover all of those bases that a permanent structure would need to cover. So the resolution covers only the requirement for competitive bidding that we waived during the need to respond in short order to get the temporary structure put in place. A permanent structure would go through the regular bidding process, and so would not be subject to the emergency provisions, which is what the resolution does. But we are pursuing opportunities at the state and federal level through the FEMA process for not only covering our costs for the emergency repairs, but potential costs for future replacement if we choose to head down that path.
Thank you. I assumed that, but I wanted to make sure, since they were presented in the same basically information coming forward. And I also assume with fish passage and compliance, we would probably be looking towards ecology and other areas for funding in order to make those improvements. But that's a whole nother discussion in the future. But I do move approval.
We have a motion before us to approve the cost for the emergency repairs to the bridge that was washed out on 19th Street. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, I'll bring forward recognition for the resolution, but I don't want to leave this item just yet. I was thinking very much along the lines of Ms. Anderson. That's a pretty expensive bridge to serve very few homes. The county had a similar issue, I think, with a Mosquito Lake Road bridge or some other bridge that was like really expensive and served very few homes. And some council members in the county voted against it. It didn't seem like a fair use of money. And I was going to ask about that, but you raised an interesting issue. This is on Chuckanut Creek, is it not? And
Yes.
we've done substantial upstream projects for fish passage, and we're under a court order, we, the entire state, to create a fish passability and therefore better habitat availability in salmon bearing streams, and Chuckanut Creek is one of those. Am I on track on all that?
Yes, absolutely. And this is I think safe to say there's going to be a rather robust public conversation about how and what we use to replace, or I might offer, if we choose to replace that structure. However, the time's not right for that conversation. We need to gather some more information and get some more perspectives on things. But I suspect that conversation will be robust and public in nature. We have early day possibility of building a road to the south to access Chuckanut Highway. And the first thumbnail glance, what that cost might be, might approach $9 million. And so you have a very expensive proposition to do a secondary road, extensive proposition to build a bridge. Lots of complicating factors related to floodplains, related to fish passage, related to critical areas, related to lots of various interests that require some careful thought and deliberation at the council as a policy level, at a regulatory level that will need more time to vet through. But I think it's appropriate to say that this temporary structure that we have in place is temporary, but it will last for the time it's going to take us to make those decisions and deal with the consequences of that.
So I guess my thinking is that I place a higher priority on our obligation to restore fish habitat than I do to serving a minority of houses. I hate to say this, I think I know people who live on the far side of that bridge, and I don't want to leave them stranded. I'm wondering if Mr. Stamps or someone else would let me know, do we have an obligation, we the city, to restore a formally established bridge to duly permitted and constructed homes?
Matt Stamps, legal department. Michael, I've started looking at that and I've been in some preliminary discussions with staff, but I'm really not, I don't think today's the right place to opine on that. I need some more time to look at it, and we'll certainly be prepared to brief council on that in the future, probably in the executive session.
Okay, Ms. Anderson, your hand is up.
Yeah, I just wanted to assure the residents of that location that whether there's 4 or 40 homes in that location, they're part of Bellingham. And I know personally, I'm committed to make sure that they have safe, accessible access to their homes, considering all the environmental constraints. We also have to take a look when the time comes on EMS response times and other things if we decided to reroute. So there's a lot of things to consider, but I just wanted them to rest assured that, they will be served. And it is, at least for me, a priority to make sure that they have safe and transport ability that they had before. So whether it's one house or more, they're Bellingham. So we will make sure that they're served.
Okay, so we've already voted on the action item in this regard. Just a point of information, the permanent bridge, might that discussion come forward in 2022 or might it be more like 2023? What are we looking at?
Yes, probably in both years, I would suspect.
Okay.
I think what we have some work to do in terms of, like Mr. Stamps alluded to, and Chaz got some work to do as well. But I suspect there will be a robust public conversation about this particular topic.
Okay, thank you. We'll go on to our last item. I'm glad we went through the other items quickly. It'll give us at least a half hour or so to discuss something of considerable importance, at least to me personally. It has to do with an update from our broadband advisory work group. This is the second such update from the broadband advisory work group, which has been meeting monthly since February of 2021. A member of the work group will be here to present a summary of of efforts and the status at this point. City Council Resolution number 2020-13 in Section 4 directs the work of that group to be completed by December of 2021. So we had hoped that maybe their work would be finished by now. Additional time to complete the work, however, is needed due to delays in the work related to city staff availability and the impacts of COVID. Staff's recommendation, therefore, is for the completion of the work outlined in the resolution to be extended by the council right now by a motion until September of 2022. I believe Mr. Keeler will be here to present to the work group or the committee. Mr. Johnson, any opening remarks though?
Nope, I have nothing to add to that. The recommended motion is included as on the agenda packet. We just need a couple more months to get that ready to go. And Chris Keeler is on the call here. I see his name on my screen. So if we get him to turn himself on and.
Mr. Keeler, if you're able to, please unmute yourself. Thank you for sharing your video. Go ahead, and thank you for being here. And thank you, by the way, for serving on the work group.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me. My name is Chris Kyler. I've been a member of the work group, and we're very, very happy to share what we've been able to accomplish in the last 3 months. A lot has happened since we brought Magellan Advisors on board. So it's, even though this is covering like less than half of the space of time since our last update, I think it's going to be very eventful. So I will share my screen and we will get right into it. So can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So broadband advisory work group update. December 13th, our last update was in late July. So we're going to be covering 3 meetings, as well as additional meetings that have happened with Magellan Advisors. There's a slight typo on this slide. They're Magellan Advisors, not Magellan Consulting. So the 5 main accomplishments that we've done is Magellan Advisors was selected as the partner for the city's community municipal broadband study. They presented their capabilities to us in one meeting that was entirely devoted to that. And then they've given us regular updates at all of our regular meetings, as well as the additional meetings that a small subgroup of our work group has been meeting with them every 2 weeks. We also had a meeting dedicated to ex officios presenting just in general, their assessment of the city's market. There were 5 questions prepared for them, and then an open Q&A period with work group members. We also had 2 public sector, well, 1.5 public sector presentations. Mr. Clem Kleppe from Mount Vernon presented on the city's open access hybrid model system that has been in place since the year 2000. And we had a short update from Ms. Gina Stark regarding the Port and PUD's partnership. Just kind of a brief teaser. The main update is going to occur in January. And finally, we had one of our own work group members present to the group on plus codes, which is a new technological innovation that came out in last year, and we believe could be very helpful for provisioning and locating these services and assets. So I'm going to devote quite a bit of time to speaking about Magellan Advisors, because that is, I think, the main event. So the purpose of the municipal broadband study is to explore and understand the municipal broadband market, the opportunities and potential risks, including technical and financial feasibility of a municipal broadband deployment, and address access, equitability, and affordability. That's just the scope of work defined in the RFP that Magellan Advisors responded to and was selected for. So our primary contacts are Mr. Greg Laudeman and Mr. Jory Wolf. They've been at every one of our meetings since the partnership was announced, 3 meetings so far. And they have created a survey for us that is live and accessible through Bellingham's website. There's a link to that survey later on in the slide deck. At our last update, we heard that there were over 1,100 total responses and over 600 of them fully complete with all the questions answered. I'm sure that number has gone up a lot since that meeting on December 7th. So the survey will be live until December 31st, and we have reached the 500 responses that Magellan was hoping for statistical accuracy. But the more responses we get, the more information we will have available. All of this data from the survey and the analysis that Magellan will complete with it is going to be left to the city, including the GIS data and the deep technical dive. So the more information we can get now, the better. The scope of work is included there in bullet point form. And I want to just share something that was that relates specifically to the business model analysis and financial analysis that was shared during our last big update with Magellan Advisors. The scope of work defined in Resolution 2020-31 defines basically 4 tiers of potential municipal broadband deployments: fully public option, a public-private partnership, dark fiber, and open access. During our last update, Magellan Advisors shared kind of a ladder of different tiers of service that they've seen and encountered in their many years serving public broadband markets. So he defined and explained 7 tiers if you count public policy as a tier. These overlap with the 4 tiers defined in our scope of work in the resolution, but they do extend and in some ways differ from them. One tier of note is the institutional and public service tier, which is where the city of Bellingham currently stands with our fiber that serves public institutions. A comment was made during this last presentation that the higher you climb on this ladder of service tiers, the higher the failure rate gets. Mr. Laudeman conceded that this point was well-grounded, but stressed that the success of projects they've seen is due to predictable factors such as technologically savvy and visionary leadership from government, private sector, and business sector leaders. So that agrees strongly with what we've heard before from Mr. Jim Lemberg of the city of Anacortes, and what I will share with you shortly from Mr. Kim Kleppe of the city of Mount Vernon. So it's, what we're essentially hearing is that we can land anywhere we want on this tier as long as we're fully committed. That's what we're hearing from most of the professionals and experts that we're hearing from. I would really recommend watching the full video of the updates from Magellan Advisors. Actually, Mr. Johnston, could I ask you a quick question? Are you aware if the bi-weekly meetings are recorded as well, or just our main public meetings?
Just the main public meetings. The bi-weekly meetings are really a project management and not a public forum. So it's a chance for me to talk with the consultant directly about how things are coming along. Okay,
awesome. So the only 2 meetings for the full updates from Magellan Advisors, but just lots of great info, far more than I could relay in the short time we have. So the next big accomplishment that we had a meeting devoted to private sector presentations. 5 questions were posed to the ex officios. These questions were about the impact of COVID on broadband delivery, the ISP's plans for future efforts to achieve just general broadband expansion, as well as achieve equity and full community access, the synergies ISPs look for in a public-private partnership. Definitely some great responses to there, which I highlighted with number 3 here on this list, and what the ISPs felt were missing from the city's assessment of the broadband market. After these 5 questions were answered, work group members had the opportunity to ask our own questions of ex officios during this time, and through comments earlier, we discussed access programs such as voucher programs or that kind of thing, economic development and emerging technologies such as 5G, 6G, mesh networks. So really great discussion. I think I will read these quotes just to give. And this is just a small slice of the insight that our ex officio shared with us. So when Wave was speaking, one thing that stood out was they said in new HOAs and developments, the city should force them to put in a new conduit. Right now, you are boxing these houses in and potentially limiting their services. Mesh systems will come in the near future, but if the city can force anyone doing underground work to install conduit, say as part of your permit fee, this will keep options open. So this is almost low-hanging fruit. This is essentially referring to a dig once policy, and the matter of public policy as seen by Magellan Advisors is a tier below even where we are at with our institutional service model. So I thought this was a really great point from Wave. And just for the record, these quotes are from the notes, not transcribed exactly from the video. So if you go back and watch that video, it might be stated a little differently. Mr. Terry Davis with Comcast shared that Comcast is an approved vendor for the emergency broadband benefit, as well as the emergency connection fund for libraries and schools that is administered through the FCC. And this program is not going away and will continue to be invested in by Comcast. So this is one method that has been discussed a lot on our work group. If there are wire lines going in front of these houses that don't have internet service, why is that? Is it a financial barrier? And how can we work around that and find a solution that works with the ISPs and the homeowners and the city to get service to them potentially quicker and cheaper than deploying new fiber. Quote number 3. This is, I thought, really helpful for us. Mr. David Nemera said that when it comes to public-private partnerships, we seek predictability in terms of time, cost, construction, outcome goals, and the longevity of the program. They're looking for a long-term and long-range vision. So that, we're glad the ex officios are here on our work group and discussing these matters with us. And hopefully, as we move forward and make recommendations, we can get even more specific details about how to best manage a public-private partnership, if that is an option that we recommend. Mr. Kim Kleppe, the information services for Mount Vernon, was one of the next presenters, and he presented on the history of Mount Vernon's broadband system. It's been in place since the year 2000. The city was dissatisfied with their service. In 1998, they essentially only had like copper and DSL. Wave came to the city in the year 2000, the same year Mount Vernon launched their own fiber and open access hybrid fiber model, which is essentially a government to business model and would be the second highest tier on the ladder shared by Mr. Laudeman. So there were a lot of lessons learned that Mr. Kleppe shared with us. These include community buy-in from businesses, government, education, and the tech sector. This is very similar to the lesson learned that I shared from Mr. Laudeman earlier about how these, what factors predict success. The importance of community champions and making sure your deployment plan works for everyone in the community. He also recommended, having a full development and business plan, revenue requirements, and knowing how you're going to obtain funding, having most of these details worked out before you undertake the project. He also stressed the importance of documentation, record keeping, including GIS data, as well as ongoing maintenance of the network. So how the open access model works in Mount Vernon is that the city builds the fiber, they build the last mile, they own all of it. There's no arguing about who's going to pay for that cost, but they do not answer repair calls from businesses because ISPs come in and are able to lease fiber and deliver the service from a network layer and a customer service layer on the city's physical infrastructure. So there's some statistics down there. It's a passive optical network, which is the most commonly used technology. 20% it's government use, 7% dark fiber leasing, and I just shared the last bullet point. So that was Mr. Kim Kleppe, and again, would recommend watching the video if you have the time. The port and PUD, I was under the impression that we would have a longer presentation from them when I made this slide. So the longer presentation is upcoming in January, as a matter of fact. We did hear from Miss Gina Stark of the Port of Bellingham about the new Community Economic Revitalization Board standards recently passed by the legislature. These bring the standards of the CERB in line with the goals of the Washington State Broadband Act. So they update the tiers for broadband speeds to consider 100 megabits per second down, 20 megabits per second up unserved, 100 by 70 underserved, and 150 symmetrical served. These, so again, with these align with the 2019 State Broadband Act goals for 2028. They differ from the FCC's broadband standards. As defined in our resolution 2020-31, forming the work group, we already consider these FCC standards to be inadequate for the goals of the Bellingham community, and this movement by the CERB just kind of reinforces that, not only the CERB, but the Washington State Legislature in general and Bellingham, we all consider that we have higher needs than the FCC considers adequate. One more thing we had was a presentation on plus codes by one of our own work group members. So plus codes are a technology that came out in 2020. They didn't generate a lot of press due to the COVID pandemic, but we believe they could be a transformative technology. One, they use latitude and longitude data, but they're quickly displayed and encoded as groups of numbers and letters. These codes can be as short as 4 to 8 characters if you're in the same like city as the person sharing the code with you. So the full code, if you didn't have any reference point of a city, would be a little longer, but in the city, the codes can be very short. They can be used to receive deliveries, access social and emergency services, and they're innately compatible with Google Maps, which is a platform in widespread use, being downloaded on over 10 billion devices in the App Store. So this is something that our work group members stressed as being really transformative and kind of an exceptional opportunity, because not only is this technology, more universal than a street address, which not everyone has, more memorable and comprehensible by a human than the latitude and longitude data that it's based in. It's also already compatible with a huge number of devices. So I'm going to do a quick demo. So if you go to plus.codes, this is the website. It has a lot more information. We're going to go to find your code, and defaults to here. I'm not going to show what my code is, sorry, but we're going to go to 210 Lottie Street, Bellingham, Washington. And there is City Hall. You could see the plus code down here at the bottom of the screen. So this is a slightly high, lower resolution code. If we double clicked on this, you can see this 3 by 3 meter area added an additional 1 code to the plus code, or 1 letter to the plus code. One other advantage of these, I'm just zooming back out here, so it dropped back down to 6 characters. If I click on these 4 squares here, you can see this code ends in 3C, go over by 1, the code ends in 3F, go down by 1, it goes to 2, and the second to last character returns to F, the same character that was up there, and then goes to 2F here. So there's this regular pattern where there's an alphanumeric pattern to the codes. This means that, say you like didn't hear one letter right, or you didn't, you couldn't read someone's handwriting, your code would still be pretty accurate and get you in the right vicinity. Compared to street addresses, plus codes can be really useful. We just had this flooding event and we lost, there's a lot of damage. We may have lost some street signs, houses may have lost their addresses. So if we were using plus codes to locate these households, to locate assets such as telephone poles, utility poles, access access points for networks, it would be something that no flood or tornado or windstorm is going to take away the latitude and longitude data. So we would maintain a lot of that information. And these can be used alongside addresses. They are in addition to, not an alternative to, a traditional address. So this is something that could be really transformative and was recommended by our work group member, not only for consideration with mapping the assets of a broadband network, but also in general, connecting people with social and emergency services. Now, here's the link to the survey that is live and accessible until the 31st. Again, we have over 1,000 responses, but we want more. So if you are able to share this link, share it far and wide, and paper versions are available through the Bellingham Public Library. And there's also a Spanish version that you can select online. So that is my presentation. The actual work group videos go into a lot more depth. We have some really amazing professionals coming in from public sector, private sector, and sharing great information with us. So I see a hand raised, Mr. Knudsen.
Chris, I just want to thank you and the committee for the work that you're doing. There's a lot of noise out there and a lot of comments about the city of Bellingham and its advisory committee, but I just want to let you know, as an outgoing council member now and somebody who has followed this issue for many years, thank you. And thank your committee for the work you're doing, and it will benefit the citizens of Bellingham. So thank you.
Well, yeah, we're happy to help, and I'll definitely pass on your thanks. And thank you.
Mr. Kyler, could you stop sharing your screen so we can see more people, and we'll see if there's more points of discussion. You talked about the Anacortes program. I'd say it's been going for quite some time. And you also talked about the 4-tier or the 7-tier way of dividing up the range of possibilities for municipal involvement in broadband. Where is Mount Vernon on that? Are they an open access model? Are they a dark fiber? You said there was some dark fiber, but it seems like it's mostly an open access model. Can you say where they fall on that spectrum?
Yeah, I can say, I think I would have to ask Magellan advisors where they think exactly. They use slightly different terminology. So the fully public residential service model is where Anacortes falls, which is the highest tier on Magellan's ladder. And then Mount Vernon is basically one tier below that, because they are primarily focused on serving businesses. Mount Vernon is deploying a little bit of fiber to homes and residences, but they're primarily focused on business. So I could just read a little bit of my notes from that meeting. For tier 5, the commercial broadband tier, that is a city financed and operated service. It's government to business, which requires competing with other internet service providers and maintaining the high standards that people expect from the broadband industry, which Mr. Laudeman called 5 nines, so 99.999% uptime. And it was noted that for high-tech businesses and ventures such as incubation spaces, co-working spaces, laboratories. Fiber is a must. There's just nothing else that can provide the services they need. As well as providing internet, the city or a city providing commercial broadband to businesses could also provide phone and other services. So that would be where Mount Vernon is, where Anacortes is, with the network that they are working on rolling out. It's a much younger network than Mount Vernon. They provide full retail and residential broadband. So they provide service both to businesses and to households. The city finances, owns, and operates everything. They have to deal with residential customers, which Mr. Laudeman noted can be the most expensive and challenging aspect of broadband. And this tier 6 is to be considered more challenging than working with institutional and commercial markets. And then back to the city, we would be on tier 2, which is institutional and public service. So focused on internal operations, serving public institutions like cities, not cities, schools, libraries, police departments, fire departments. There's little competition with local providers, except that, and I quote, local government is a cash cow for providers. That's in the video. So there's a bit of competition there when the city decides to go solo. They're kind of taking away a source of income for an incumbent provider. We already have that. So if there was ever, that's already happened. Between the institutional and public service tier and the commercial or full retail tiers that Mount Vernon and Anacortes are at, there's the infrastructure only tier, which involves deploying the physical hardware, but not really handling any of the management of it, even on the technical side, much less like a customer service side. Then up from the infrastructure only tier, there's the open access / wholesale tier. This is kind of how Mr. Kleppe defined and named the Mount Vernon services. But if you compare the description of how he described the network to how Mr. Laudeman describes these tiers, and I think Mr. Laudeman is a great resource here. Mount Vernon is more in the commercial broadband tier. The open access, so the open access tier is compared to infrastructure only involves a greater technological provisioning of services. It may involve deploying the optics on the fiber, lighting the network, working with ISPs to manage the network from a technical sense. And it's a more active model that will have greater government to business sales and customer service personnel requirements. There's just different terminology, different labels for these different networks. So,
okay, great. I appreciate that, Mr. Kyler. Committee members, any further questions? Say, I have a few more questions. I think we still have time, Hannah. We got about 15 more minutes if we take it all.
Correct.
Okay, well, so first, the order of the day is the request to move the delivery date of the advisory work group's final report to September. Tell me how you feel about that. Is the work group making good progress, or is there difficult making headway?
I think that we're making really good progress, and we have a lot of things left to do on our list. That first slide I shared, we're going to hear from the PUD and the port. We were hoping to speak with Christopher Mitchell from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, as well as Christopher Yu from the University of Pennsylvania. So these are just professionals, experts in the field. We are trying to devote a little more time to kind of internal discussion at the meetings, talking about where we're going and how we're doing. And we we're going to get a lot of data from Magellan Advisors, and we're going to have to create that final product, which is a question I have for you that I could say, but I would like to ask about the council's expectations regarding that product. So the more time we have, I think, the more we'll be able to take our time and not rush and create a really polished final product. September might be further out than necessary, but we can always wrap up early and have a casual debrief meeting or two. So I think it's a good extension.
Okay, so my philosophy is kind of to give maximal empowerment and latitude to advisory work groups. That's why we seek your outside counsel and expertise and involvement. So I'm comfortable extending it. I assume that we will have an update sometime in spring and maybe sometime in summer. We won't just not hear from you for a while. A procedural question to extend the deadline. Do we need to pass a resolution to basically formally change the deadline? How does that need to be handled?
Mr. Lilliquist, in the council packet, it says a motion to extend that agenda, extend that date. I think that'd be sufficient, but Mr. Stamps could correct me if I got that wrong.
No, that's correct.
Okay, so that would be the action if the committee and the council wanted to take it. Ms. Anderson, your hand is up.
Thank you. I felt the extension is pretty reasonable, given that there's a survey happening. That information will have to be compiled. It would have to be shared, the analysis. Taking a look at what you've accomplished so far, any work group committee, it takes a little while to get things up and running and rolling and kind of gel together, because you guys had to have your discussions on really what to pull together and how to go forward. We kind of gave you overall goals, but not necessarily the process to do it in. So I think you guys are making, you've got it moving well. And then I was also thinking that hopefully by summer, a lot of that information comes together. And then not only the written report, but that ability to do the presentation and any follow-up sessions. So I'm comfortable with the extension. I want to make sure that you have the time and resources to be able to really do a great analysis on our best solutions going forward, and rushing it and perhaps not getting the best product out of your work and commitment doesn't make sense to me. This is important to get done, but it's not critical in the sense that we had to have it, last week in order to function as a city. So this potentially could have major shifting changes for the city, and maybe not, but we just really need to make sure that you guys have the support needed for a good product. So with that, I'm comfortable moving, making the motion that we extend as presented in the packet.
Okay, we have a motion before us to modify the due date for the final report from the Broadband Advisory Work Group to no later than September of 2022. Is there any further discussion of this? Okay, I'm going to want to continue the discussion, but let's take care of the motion first. All those in favor of recommending approval of the extension of the deadline signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, I'll bring that forward, a positive recommendation. I have a few more questions, but committee members, anything at this point from you? So first a comment and then a question. With regard to the port and the PUD, I think they are two of the most important partners for the city to consider, and therefore I'm very glad that the work group is also hearing from them. I'm particularly pleased with how the port is stepping up, as you say, involvement with the Community Economic Revitalization Board. Nationally and across the state, there's a heavy emphasis on broadband equity as it applies to underserved areas, which usually means rural areas and unincorporated areas. So that's where all the money and availability and effort is in general, not inside cities like our own, but I think we need to consider how our efforts inside city limits can tie into those larger efforts for unincorporated areas and underserved areas. And I would note that the PUD has, I think, just hired a new general manager specifically with broadband experience and expertise, and they have a committed staff member devoted to these broadband issues. This is a sea change for the PUD, which has always been able to get into and broadband and dabbled in broadband decades ago, but is really opening up a new area of expertise and activity. And again, it's important for the city to be aware of that and connect to it in all ways possible. Here's the question, and this really is more for planning staff, potentially, or legal staff. One of the requests by one of the private partners is to have something like a dig once policy for private development. City of Bellingham has a dig once policy for municipal projects. When we dig up the street, we consider whether or not we need to add additional conduit, and that policy was revised, I think, just last year, maybe, to increase the range of considerations. But what about a dig once type policy for private development? What is currently required with regard when there's a private subdivision? Are there any requirements for providing conduit or broadband type utilities on private development?
Mr. Lucas, I'm not sure I have somebody from the planning development on the call today. I recall that we may have talked a little bit about that a couple of years ago. I have a vague recollection that that would require a new development regulation in the city of Bellingham, which would be a type 6 process to consider that. And that at that point in time, we chose not to do that. But certainly we can come back to the committee with more information at that at a later point in time.
I would be interested in that, but of course, it'd be nice if we had a clear understanding from the advisory work group whether or not they thought that was something the city should start spending time and effort looking into. You know what I'm saying?
One of the goals, Chris alluded to this, is the resolution gives recommendation to the council on a policy recommendation to move things forward. And as we've talked about it many times over the last couple of years with the council, that we need to establish first the policy basis for future decisions. So I think one of my hopes for this process is that we come out of this process with not only a policy recommendation, but a clear set of definitions as to from which we can build decisions and conversations. For example, establishing a base speed, establishing a base definition of what access or equitability or affordability is. And here's the policy of the city and how we want to achieve that. And from that policy basis, then we can make recommendations on specific code requirements of development regulations or city actions that then result in the implementation of that. But as I understood, the resolution council passed was to establish first the policy basis and the needs declaration, and then move forward from that point on. The establishment of a development regulation would of necessity say, here, what's the interest, the public interest to be served by requiring developers to install that. And then from that becomes the implementation based on that public policy determination. But so I think there's a little bit of time before we get to that, but certainly the work that Mr. Kyler and others are engaged in should provide that springboard from which to make those actions.
Thank you, Eric. Mayor Fleetwood, I see that you turned your video on. Do you have additional input?
No, Eric covered it. I was just going to suggest that to answer your question fully, I think we need some time to prep for it. And it sounds like that was conveyed. But I will seize this moment just to thank Chris for his presentation. You're doing really good work. It's going to pay dividends for the future of Bellingham. And we're grateful for it. So thank you.
Okay, committee members, anything else? We're almost out of time. So I understand that moving forward.
Sorry to interject.
Yes, go ahead, Chris.
I had a little bit of technical difficulties there. I had to dial in. I would just say that I think regarding the policy recommendations that we make, I think that we will end up making recommendations for a number of different tiers as laid out both in the scope of work and by Magellan advisors. So, depending on where the leadership in the city, both public, private, community leadership, wants to put the city, we should have recommendations for the, maybe not all 7 rungs because that would just kind of be gross overkill. But, 3 or 4 rungs of that ladder. Hey, do we just want to stick with the institutional service that we have? Okay, here's what policies we should revamp and how we can make our policies stronger. Do we want to do a infrastructure deployment where we're partnered with ISPs? Okay, here's the best way to do that. We've spoken with our ex officios and this is what they're looking for in a partnership. Do we want to go a little further and actually be administering the service? Okay, here's what it would look like to do that to businesses. Here's what it would look like to do that to residences. So I think, we can't make that decision for the city on what option is best, but we can give recommendations for the different options on how to implement them best, whatever decision or whatever option is selected.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kyler. That's good. So I'm going to wrap this up with a little personal opinion. I know that it normally makes sense to have the horse before the cart, but sometimes on some efforts, I've urged that we bring the cart forward a bit, maybe alongside the horse, maybe a little bit in front. We did that with the conduit policy, where we actually expanded the range of the considerations, even though the broadband advisory work group had not spoken to that issue yet. I'm willing to move forward on preliminary recommendations. If the advisory work group has reached conclusions or has tentative recommendations prior to their final report, I think it'd be good to hear about those. We don't need to wait till September to start receiving at least some of your input. I'd be willing to move some of these items into the work plan earlier than waiting till September, if indeed there is some consensus reached on them. But at this point, I don't think there's any request to be made of the administration to move forward on that. Any further comments or discussions? If not, I'm going to go ahead and terminate this meeting. Okay, so
I did have one question for City Council, and thank you for that recommendation. We're happy to share some preliminary recommendations. We had a discussion at one of our recent meetings about what the final deliverable should look like. There were comparisons made to the Climate Action Task Force and their deliverable, which was quite lengthy, a lot of information, very dense. And there was overall a consensus on our work group that we wanted a shorter deliverable, at least a version like a quick version that would be like 10 to 20 pages, and then maybe an additional longer report that went into more depth. If the City Council could provide some guidance on what the most helpful final deliverable would be, that would help us.
So it's a little bit difficult to do because I think the subject matter kind of determines it. But I agree. I think that the Climate Action Task Force not only covered a large topic, but a topic that touched upon many technical areas. And so I don't imagine that the report would be that scale. Sort of take that climate action report and say, just look at one section, right? On buildings or on transportation. It was still pretty sizable. Transportation alone might have been 25 pages. It's hard for me to personally give recommendations, but I do expect it to be smaller than the Climate Action Task Force. I don't know, committee members, do you have any guidance for Mr. Kyler and the work group? Lisa?
Thank you. I always think, we read a lot of technical information, and the longer we're on council, a little bit more adept we are to get through it and pull the information out. I think the report should be as much for community members as it is for council, because there's a lot of interest. So I personally would like to see, as you had mentioned, more of a summary, and then an addendum that has a lot more additional information that could be referred to. I would also like to see from, kind of like a ranked choice voting, the top recommendation, and then the benefit and cost analysis of that, if that's at all possible, so that, and then rank it on down based on goals for the community, which would be, affordability, best access, reliability, all of that type of information, like what would get us the best product especially my concern is for businesses, looking at, employment sector for our current times and going forward, it's so heavily relied upon internet and technology. So I want to make sure that Bellingham has the best affordable product that we're going to be able to get businesses to come to Bellingham. And if we can serve businesses really well, then we can serve other communities, people in education, people at home well also. So for me, I'd like to see that top recommendation, why, and then kind of what that overall, cost menu would be for implementation, and then move down, and then we can kind of consider that balance. And then again, that cheat sheet, bulleted point, and then the narrative to come, so that we could okay, so number one, this is the top recommendation. Now I can go to page, 12 and then read 5 pages that is, much more at length. So I think if I wasn't on council and I was a community member and I wanted to not necessarily read a 200-page report on something, more likely I'm going to read that 5 to 10-page report to try to pull as much information to make my opinion. But that's, kind of how I would look at it. But I'm also open to how other council members would want to receive it.
That's excellent guidance. I would just like to note that serving businesses is going to be slightly easier than serving households because businesses and other institutions are more geographically condensed, as well as the customer service of serving households has been noted as a challenging aspect. So, but yeah, I definitely got down your points and your priorities, Council Member Anderson, and I really appreciate it.
Okay, Chris, the work group should feel free to ask for further clarifications if needed going forward. Don't feel this is your only opportunity to seek clarifications from the council. I note that other council members are now showing up for the next committee meeting. Is there anybody else, committee members or non-committee members, who'd like to give feedback at this point? Hearing none, I'm going to go ahead and conclude the Public Works and Natural Resources Committee for the day and return the meeting back over to Council President Stone.
Thank you.